Often what comes up in an enterprise when we look at our staff and information security, cybersecurity, how we manage that is the great question. Do we insource it? Do we outsource it? Or do we co-source it? To have a look at the few differences, insourcing means that we've got dedicated staff that is on our payroll as a staff member. Training resources for the staff is usually required by the enterprise itself. On the other side of the coin, we've got at the extreme outsourcing, which a service provider would provide contractor and consultants to come do the work. They might be stationed on your site or coming now and then, depending on what the requirements are. And the training by those staff is usually required to be provided by either if it's a consultant or contractor himself because he increases his career, or by the outsourced party. And the other final one is co-sourcing, where we have an external skilled dedicated team or person to provide security consulting on your insourced staff. You have dedicated staff on site, but with limited skills. So we look at those. Now, irrespective of this, what I'd like to do is actually look at some horror stories in all three aspects, which I have found in my consulting career. The first one, dedicated security staff, dedicated network staff. However, we found that regular frauds were taking place from a smaller point of view. Here and there, it could be staff internal mostly, but then one year there was a huge, large incident. What we found after going in, fundamentals were not implemented, monitoring and reporting are lacking, in-source, but reactive based on incidents. And you found that in your environment as well, that sometimes you only get budget once you actually have an incident or a breach in your organization. This is an example of an in-sourced environment which I actually looked at. Quite interesting. Another site I looked at, and I was actually asked to come do some security consulting, and with this engagement we found a password audit was done. Initially, the amount of people that were in the domain, in the Windows Microsoft domain Active Directory, was approximately 40,000 users. But when looking at those logon details, and we say all users that has not logged in for a certain time period, call it 30 or 60 days, they will be redundant users, and only those users logged on recently is my active users. So instead of 40,000, there were only about 14,000 active users on this domain. This domain was disparate throughout the world, a large organization. And the sad part here is that the help desk, call it that, would reset the passwords and within Windows have that tick that says force the user to change the password in the next logon. They would disable that. So active users with a default password, and call the password example here ABC123, there was approximately 8,500 users with that default password. Also, looking throughout the environment, we found a number of workstations and servers with VNC, which is Virtual Network Computing, a remote control application, with that same default password, and there were exactly 1,039 that we found in an asset scan. The number of domain administrators in this domain was 306, with 37 of those having the default password. This was an outsourced example. Just some background here as well, and once we've identified this, the outsourcer came and said, listen, they will fix it, but they don't want to load a change control because identifying this as a change control will tell other people the same problem, then we have a bigger risk. After a few weeks, the outsourcer came back and discussed that they've closed the problem, and what we've done is actually a password audit a day before, and we found out they only fixed about half, and the way they fix it is basically saying, tick, change your password, which is totally incorrect, because if I'm a hacker and I'm your system and you tell me to change my password, I'll change my password. So they were sitting in a meeting telling us, listen, they fixed it, but they had the invoice already down on the table to say, listen, they have fixed it and it's time and material. The sad part here was that when we actually started pushing back for the client, the outsourcer says, well, you can't say anything about this now because the standards define us that the procedure around the service level agreement between the outsourcer and the company says you have to load any change control, a ticket has to be generated, so you can't do anything about this. Then a final horror story here is SWIFT frauds were taking place in a couple of banks, mobile payment frauds and so on. And the findings here is that we had one ITC level as a employee, and it was basically only employee because everything else was outsourced. A large portion of the networks were infected with backdoors. The inherent security functions and features were not deployed or installed at all. This C-level, the CTO, approved $1 million security appliances to actually combat the fraud. And this was sold on a FUD, a fear, the unknown, and the distrust. And as you had this implemented, the frauds were still taking place. Because frauds are not automated by system and small hackers on the outside, but it's a whole compromise of your environment where you have a long-term compromise either from the outside or from the inside. This was actually the worst security audit in my actual career of more than 30 years. Now the question is, what should I do? Should I actually go insourced? When I actually insource, you need to make sure that measurements are adequate, and a CISO must report to a CEO. If I go outsource, I would hardly recommend that from a security stance point of view, because you can never outsource security, as you will always be accountable for security in your organization. Co-source is an option. Transfer of skills are critical here. Irrelevant or independent of your decision, cybersecurity should be monitored by metrics. So you should actually be able to monitor how many incidents do I have a month, how long does it take to respond those incidents and mitigate those security incidents. We need to actually have security audits with compliance score. How ready are we? How many weaknesses do we have in our systems? How are my system risk ranked according to the classification policy? And it would be nice to actually have a near real-time dashboard with you in your environment to make sure that your senior management and everybody can look at it that has got access to it to make sure that the stance is correct. Your cybersecurity staff must be competent and certified. And I stress on the certification purely because of certification from where at a user indicates a career more than just a job. Outsourcing companies should not be allowed to report on their own progress and results. You have to segregate those two, and I find too many that the outsource is actually telling management how good they are doing. Now, you have a security forum, hopefully in your organization. You have a chief information security officer, because we're talking about an enterprise and we really are in a large-scale environment. You have an information security officer. You have your information security analysts. If you have a SOC or a security operations center, you have those analysts there. And also from that point of view, internal audit will act as police and just check that you've done your work. External audit usually is required by governance. Automation is the key. Get the people out the process if you can. Standardization is also critical. Lock down your workstations. There are good documentation and standards based on your network and security. Specifically, if you go into the Windows Azure environment, you can lock down everything. So your next step, I would say, is get an independent party to review the enterprise security stance. They should use a cybersecurity framework that's internationally accepted, so you can measure yourself against other organizations or market-specific requirements for the metrics if you are different from certain standards. For example, if I look at government, we've got the military. There's also different kind of military specs. For example, normally we have a cybersecurity framework that we can use from NIST. If we look at the Department of Defense in America, we've got now the capability maturity model that's adapted using the cybersecurity framework from NIST. So have a look around there. Reports should be made available from that independent party for all the C levels. That's your chief security officer, your chief risk officer, your information officer, your financial officer, and so more. But no managing of those results should be allowed by the security department or things like that. Because, for example, in the horror story earlier that I mentioned, I've actually identified that the $1 million that they have spent was totally unnecessary because they've already had products that they bought 2 years ago that they've never implemented that would have sufficed to actually combat the frauds. During the submission to the risk committee, this critical item was actually removed from the reporting line and made sure that that C-level, that only person that was employed by the organization, either covers his mistake or what transpired there. Now, also, finally, then we should look at security metrics using automation, removing the ability for staff to mark their own homework. Now, there's a few standards we can actually look at. You can actually look at my risk appetite of organization. We can look at the Cybersecurity Risk Framework. That you can actually look at that. My policies that you have to develop in the organization. And there's so many more things you can actually do. So what I would suggest, make a comment, contact, and pose a question. We'll actually answer it online.